Hashtag the vanished port cities of Tyre and Sidon. The Mediterranean harbors no monument to the merchants who once ruled it. Where Tyre and Sidon stood, two of history's greatest port cities, the modern eye finds only fragments, a scatter of Roman columns, a few sunken walls, some terracotta shards tumbled into the sand. Yet for nearly 1,000 years, these two Phoenician cities commanded the ancient world's wealth and imagination the way global financial centers do today. They were not capitals of empires in the traditional sense. They were something far more diffuse and enduring, the nerve centers of a mercantile network that spanned from the Atlantic coast of North Africa to the tin mines of Cornwall, from the cedar forests of Lebanon to the purple dye workshops that made Phoenician cloth the luxury standard of pharaohs and kings. By any measure of their own time, Tyre and Sidon were incomparably powerful. And then, almost without trace, they vanished. This is not a story of sudden catastrophe, though catastrophes came. It is instead a study in how civilizations built on trade rather than territorial conquest can leave almost nothing behind. The Phoenicians built ships, not pyramids. They wove cloth and extracted dye, they did not commission inscriptions on stone. Their greatest achievement was a writing system they gave to the world, the alphabet that became Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and yet we struggle to know them as anything but a name in classical texts, a civilization glimpsed through the prejudiced eyes of those who envied and opposed them. To understand what Tyre and Sidon were, we must first travel backward through time to the geography that created them. The Phoenician homeland occupied a narrow strip of the Levantine coast, in what is now Lebanon. Here, a mountain range rises almost immediately from the sea. The land offers little room for agriculture, less still for empire in the traditional sense. But what it offers abundantly is something far more valuable: ancient cedar forests that grow nowhere else in the world, and a coastline studded with natural harbors. The Phoenicians did not choose to become merchants. Geography made them merchants, and they excelled at it with an almost unsettling pragmatism. Tyre lay about 30 miles south of Sidon, though the two cities maintained a relationship that was at once collaborative and fiercely competitive. Both cities were built on two levels, a settlement on the mainland, and a more heavily fortified city on an island just offshore. This double structure was born from necessity. The island fortifications could withstand siege far better than open harbors. Centuries of conflict with Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, and eventually Greeks and Romans would prove the wisdom of this design. Yet the islands also served another purpose: they were natural warehouses, protected and defensible storage points for the goods that flowed constantly through these ports. By the second millennium before Christ, Tyre and Sidon were already well established, though their rise to true prominence came during the decline of other Mediterranean powers. Around the 12th century BCE, when the late Bronze Age civilizations, the Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites, the great Egyptian dynasties entered a period of severe contraction, the Phoenicians moved into the vacuum. They possessed three advantages that proved decisive: ships superior to anything their neighbors could build, a willingness to trade with anyone regardless of politics or religion, and a talent for identifying what the ancient world wanted and finding a way to supply it. The dye trade became synonymous with Phoenician wealth. A tiny murex snail, found abundantly along their coast, contained within its shell a gland that produced a brilliant purple pigment. The extraction process was laborious and unpleasant. Each snail yielded only a microscopic amount of dye. Producing 1 kilogram of this purple required crushing somewhere between 8 and 10 million snails. The resulting color, known today as Tyrian purple, was so rare and so magnificent that only the wealthiest individuals in the ancient world could afford cloth dyed with it. Kings and emperors wore it. The Byzantine emperors would later call themselves born to the purple. Tyre became the epicenter of this trade, and the profit margins were extraordinary. A single bolt of purple cloth could fetch the price of a small vineyard. But the Phoenicians were never simply dye merchants, just as they were never simply shipbuilders or simply traders. They were dealers in connectivity itself. A Phoenician merchant, departing from Tyre on a trading voyage, might carry cedar wood and linen to Egypt, take on papyrus and grain, sail north to trade those for tin from Anatolia, then carry the tin westward to Cyprus or Crete, where it would be traded for local goods, which would then be sent to yet another market. The complexity of these networks was extraordinary. They required not just navigation skills and business acumen, but trust across cultures, knowledge of multiple languages, understanding of foreign customs, and an almost modern cosmopolitanism. It was this cosmopolitanism that made the Phoenicians simultaneously admired and despised. The Greeks, who themselves became a great maritime power, regarded the Phoenicians with a mixture of envy and moral condemnation. The Greek historians, our primary written sources for ancient Mediterranean history, portrayed Phoenicians as shrewd, sometimes dishonest traders willing to sacrifice anything for profit. There was probably truth to this, just as there is truth to similar accusations leveled at any merchant class that grows very wealthy. But what the Greeks recorded was tinged with the particular resentment of those who had been outcompete. The Phoenicians had been conducting long-distance trade for centuries before Greek cities began organizing their colonial ventures. Sidon was already ancient and powerful when Tyre was still rising. The height of Phoenician power, the period when Tyre especially entered the consciousness of the entire ancient world, came in the 9th and 8th centuries before Christ. This was the era when Tyre's king Hiram the Great ruled, a figure so legendary that he appears in biblical texts as a friend and ally to King Solomon of Israel. The historical Hiram may or may not have met Solomon. The biblical account is notoriously difficult to verify. But the historical Hiram, if we accept the archaeological and textual evidence, was a genuine builder and expansionist. He strengthened the island fortifications. He expanded the harbor facilities. Most importantly, he directed Tyre's gaze westward, toward the Mediterranean's western basin and beyond. It was under rulers like Hiram that Tyre established the colony of Carthage on the North African coast, which would eventually become Rome's greatest rival. The Phoenicians founded colonies not as territorial colonies in the sense that empires understand them, but as trading posts and secondary commercial centers. These colonies, Carthage in North Africa, Gades in Spain, settlements in Sicily and Sardinia, were ways of extending the commercial network without requiring a standing army or a centralized bureaucracy. A colony sent back profits to the mother city, and in return received protection, trade goods, and manufactured items that the colonial settlement could not produce itself. By the time we reached the classical period, the era of Socrates and Pericles in Greece, the age when the Greek city-states were asserting themselves in the Mediterranean, Tyre and Sidon were already very old cities, whose wealth was legendary, whose merchant networks had hardened into almost permanent structures of trade. And yet, from this point forward, the story of Tyre and Sidon becomes increasingly a story of vulnerability. The powers that rose around them, the Greek cities, the Persian Empire, and eventually the Roman Republic, had military resources that the Phoenician cities, for all their wealth, could not match. Tyre and Sidon would continue to exist, sometimes prospering, sometimes enduring siege and suffering occupation, but their great age of independence was entering its final centuries. The turning point came in the 4th century before Christ, when Alexander the Great decided that he could not leave Tyre unconquered. The city had remained nominally independent under Persian suzerainty, conducting its merchant operations even as empires rose and fell around it. But Alexander's vision was totalizing. When Tyre refused to submit to his authority, he did what few had been able to do before him. He built a causeway across the sea to reach the island city. He besieged it with a ferocity that the ancient world found shocking. #The vanished port cities of Tyre and Sidon, final section. When the causeway was complete and Alexander's forces poured across it, Tyre's 700-year reign as an independent maritime power effectively ended. The siege lasted 7 months. The city's defenders fought with the desperation of people who understood what was being taken from them, not merely their walls, but their autonomy, their identity as self-governing merchant princes. When the city finally fell, Alexander's soldiers massacred thousands. The historian Diodorus tells us the number was 30,000, though modern scholars suggest the figure was likely lower. What matters is not the precise accounting of death, but the symbolic rupture. Tyre, the great Phoenician city that had seemed immortal in its island fortress, had been conquered by land. After Alexander's death, his empire fragmented, and Tyre passed into the hands of the Seleucids, who ruled from Syria. For a time, the city recovered some prosperity. Its merchants, ever adaptive, continued their business under new masters. But the old independence never returned. The Mediterranean was changing. Rome was rising, and Rome had a different vision of trade and power, one that depended less on the cunning and capital of merchant cities and more on the military reach of empires. The Phoenician model, which had worked so brilliantly for 1,000 years, was becoming obsolete. Sidon, meanwhile, had taken a different path. While Tyre had grown more isolated and defended, Sidon had cultivated relationships, paid tribute, negotiated. Its artisans remained famous throughout the ancient world. Sidon's purple dye, its glassware, its metalwork, these were still sought after in Athens and Rome and Alexandria. But prosperity without independence is a precarious thing. Like Tyre, Sidon too eventually fell under foreign rule, eventually to Rome. By the time Rome finally annexed the Phoenician heartland in 64 BC, when Pompey the Great marched through Syria and declared it a province, both Tyre and Sidon were shadows of their former selves as independent powers. Yet they did not disappear. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about their decline. They did not vanish in a single cataclysm. They faded, like a shoreline disappearing into mist. Under Roman rule, both cities continued to exist. They minted coins. They maintained harbors. They produced goods. Sidon in particular experienced a kind of second flourishing in the early centuries of the Roman Empire, becoming a center of learning and craft. The great Neoplatonic philosopher Porphyry was born in Sidon. The city's schools attracted students. Its glassmakers invented new techniques that would be imitated across the Roman world. But something essential had been lost. The Phoenicians had been traders first, colonizers second, and subjects only by choice or necessity. By becoming subjects permanently, they ceased to be fully Phoenician in the way that had defined them for centuries. The merchant networks that had stretched from Spain to the Levantine coast gradually became integrated into larger imperial systems. The great ships still sailed from Tyrian and Sidonian harbors, but they sailed at the pleasure of Rome. The final blow came much later, in the 7th century of our era, when Arab armies swept across the Mediterranean coast and the Islamic world reorganized the region entirely. By then, Tyre and Sidon had already faded from the great stage of history. They became regional cities, important perhaps to their immediate hinterland, but no longer forces that shaped empires or commanded the respective distant kingdoms. What remains today are fragments. In Sidon, you can walk along the harbor and see the ruins of a crusader castle. The crusaders, centuries later, would fight over these cities as though they still held ancient power. You can see Roman columns that once supported temples. You can see pieces of Phoenician walls, though distinguishing them from later construction is often impossible. The famous purple dye workshops, which operated in underground chambers, have left behind only the faintest trace, residual stains, indentations in stone, the memory embedded in geology. Tyre's archaeological record is more fragmented still, scattered across the island and the causeway that Alexander built. What the archaeology cannot tell us, the ancient writers did. They left us descriptions of Tyre's grandeur, accounts of its markets, records of its ships. Without these texts, Tyre would be nearly invisible to us now. And perhaps this is the deepest truth about Tyre and Sidon's disappearance. They did not vanish because they failed at what they did. They vanished because the world changed around them, and the skills that had made them extraordinary, negotiation, adaptation, commercial cunning, were no longer sufficient against the overwhelming military force of empires. The Phoenicians had written their civilization onto the Mediterranean in purple dye and merchant ships, in alphabet and colony. But they had written it in water, in trade routes that could be redirected, in networks that could be absorbed. What we are left with is a paradox: two cities so influential that their influence became invisible, so thoroughly integrated into later civilizations that their own identity dissolved. The alphabet you are reading now, the one used to write these words, was shaped by Phoenician script. The very concept of a merchant republic, of a city-state whose power derived from commerce rather than conquest, owes much to their example. Yet most of us have never heard of Tyre or Sidon. Their names survive in historical texts and in the Bible, but the lived reality of their streets, their markets, their harbor life, that is gone, preserved only in fragments and the imagination. They were not destroyed. They were transformed, integrated, absorbed into larger stories. And in that quiet dissolution, there is perhaps a more poignant lesson than any dramatic fall. Civilizations do not always end in fire. Sometimes they simply fade, their achievements scattered like dust, their names becoming footnotes. Tyre and Sidon remind us that even greatness, even the kind of success that lasts for 1,000 years, is temporary. The ships have sailed away. The markets are silent. The purple dye that once defined an empire has been diluted so thoroughly that we can barely see its color anymore. Tell us, which lost civilization should we pursue next?